Hey there. So another tutorial for today's video, and what I'm going to look at today is how to get basically realistic 3D terrain from Google Earth into Stellarium, which is a astronomy planetarium simulation bit of software, so that we can pre-visualize a specific photo in a specific location. So there is an example that we can use if we hop over onto the computer. Okay, so this is Stellarium, if you're not already familiar with it, and as you can see, it basically lets us scroll around the night sky, and we can change the time, and it will merrily move everything around. We can zoom in and out, so it's pretty useful for working out where stuff is in the night sky. Now I've set the date in here to Friday the 27th of July. And let's just ping the time forwards to about 10:30. And the reason I've picked this day specifically is because you'll see the moon is there with Mars, but if I zoom in on the moon, you'll see it's actually gone dark red, and that's because it's rising as totally eclipsed, or at least it is in Europe. So as an example about how we can use the method here, I thought I would switch us over to the photographer's ephemeris. We had a look at this in my video last week about planning a landscape photography trip, and I thought let's pretend we're in the Italian Alps and we're in a little valley here. The reason I've picked this location is because there is a pretty church here in the valley, and if we scroll further south, or southeast rather, past the forest, I'll zoom out a little bit. We've got a sort of mountain range here, and as you probably already know, this blue line represents the moon's current position. So it rises over here where the light blue line is, and that's the position of it at around 10:30, where we were just looking and saw that it was nicely eclipsed. So that's okay for sort of saying, yes, we're in the right place, yes, the moon's vaguely in the right place. But how can we sort of simulate it and see what we're going to get to sort of have a more accurate idea of sort of what time it is, how high the moon will be, this kind of thing. Now in Google Earth, we can go to the same location, which was pretty much this road here. If we zoom in a bit, and we can actually spin ourselves around and move it around, and if I just make sure I'm not actually embedded in the hillside. So we can obviously see that this makes for quite a nice location if we're stood in the right place. There's no 3D building of the church, whoops, it's located around here somewhere. But those mountains do make for a pretty nice backdrop. So what we want to work out is how we can get this terrain into Stellarium. So instead of just this sort of flat landscape with a few trees, we can see how this might actually look. So I spent a while Googling this because I figured somebody must have solved this problem before, and it turns out, of course, that they have. This website, which doesn't look particularly exciting, it's just a bunch of text, basically gives the instructions for how to do it. And the starting point is to feed in your latitude and longitude and your altitude. Now one tip here, if we just go back to TPE, you'll see the altitude came out at 1320. I generally bung on a few meters because in testing this I found that sometimes if when we get back into Google Earth we're sort of embedded in the hillside, it doesn't really work how it's meant to. So I pop on a few extra meters just to avoid any problems. The other thing you want to make sure before you start is in Google Earth, go into the options and make sure that your elevation scaling is just set to 1, which is essentially real size. I'd previously got this set to 2, so all the mountains looked a bit more dramatic, and the first time I tried the technique that we're about to go through, it kind of didn't work and I was really confused as to why. So yeah, make sure that's set to 1. So on this page we enter our latitude, longitude and our slightly fudged altitude, hit submit, and it's going to give us this KML file, which if we click on will open in Google Earth. Now it's not the most exciting thing, it's basically just a bunch of numbers, but what these numbers, or these sort of waypoint numbers, all represent is from the location that we told it we were at, these are different angles of view. So 0, 0 is basically looking straight down, and then for the rest of them, the first number is essentially the elevation, and the second number is the degrees, so 0 being north, 180 being south, and we've got a whole bunch of these. So what happens is these start off looking kind of 25 degrees above, looking down, so not 25 degrees above the horizon, and then we kind of get all the way down to looking above us. So as an example, if we think that if 0 is at the bottom, 90 degrees is our horizon line, so 125, or maybe 100, 100 would be looking ever so slightly above the horizon, and we know that these mountains are slightly off to the southeast, so if 180 is south, 150 maybe, if we double click on that, and you'll see that's going to fly us to that location. And obviously we would then find that with 125 we're in the same place but we're looking slightly up, and 125 180 is the same looking up but we're now looking directly south. You get the idea. So 75 degrees and 90 is going to be looking down off to the east. Okay, so what we need to do for all of these images is basically save them. So this is the slightly time-consuming part, which I will probably now speed up as we start doing it. But basically for each one, make sure we're in snapshot view, file, save, and save image. On the first one, if you just hit into map options and turn off these, because we don't want all this stuff getting in the way on Stellarium, especially with multiple images. Leave everything else as it is. I usually hit save and give it a name, but I don't know whether it really saves. You don't need to seem to save it every single time. And then hit save image. That was a test from earlier. Let me delete that. And what we do is give it the same name that it's already got. So in this case, 0, 0. That will chug away for a moment. Okay, we can then double click on the next image. And these do seem to take a long time to scroll from one to the next, and there's probably a way of speeding this up, but I don't know what it is. So this one will be 25, 0. This one will be 2560. Okay, so let's go through the rest of these now and get them all done. Okay, so we've saved all the images there, and if we have a look in the folder, we've got a whole bunch of them with the file names that we saw earlier, and if we cycle through, we see that we're merrily spinning round clockwise, sort of lifting slightly higher up into the sky, starting at ground level. So we now need to stitch these together to make our sort of 360 degree panorama. And the software recommends using this tool, Hugin or Hugin, however the hell you pronounce it. So if we add all our images, and we want to use equirectangular, I believe, and I think 60 degrees. Let's double check. Yeah, field of view 60 degrees and equirectangular. Let's OK that. Okay, so with most panorama sort of stitching software, they will generally do a fairly decent job of auto stitching the images, but for the purposes of what we're doing, I've actually found with these sort of Google Earth images it doesn't do a brilliant job, or it certainly didn't do on the first one I tried it with, and ideally we want this to be fairly accurate. So what I've done is over here I've selected positions. When you first load it, it'll probably come in as general, but what we can do for positions is actually tell it where on our 3D sphere each of these images is sort of being projected, and we do that by entering yaw and pitch. For the purposes of what we're doing, we can pretty much ignore the roll column. So these are all our images. Yaw is actually referring to the second number, and that's sort of how many degrees around from north to south we have, so 0 being north, 180 being south, as we saw earlier. And pitch is how far up or down we're looking. Now these are a bit annoying because we can't just copy the numbers over. As the instructions state, the pitch needs to be minus 90 plus the first number, or the first number minus 90 if you find that easier to work out. The reason being that Stellarium will want sort of minus 90 degrees pitch to be pointing straight down, whereas our file has 0 as pointing straight down. So for each of these images we just need to double click on it and correct the numbers. So 25 is going to be 65 degrees down. And we need to make sure we copy over the yaw figure, which is the second one. So 60. This is 120 minus 65. So as you can tell, we now have another tedious bunch of entering some data to do. So once again, I will fast forward through this bit. Okay, so that's all the figures entered. Hopefully they're all correct and I've not made a mistake, but I'm not going to guarantee it. Anyway, once we're done, if we go to the Stitcher tab, and we can enter the recommended size. So this suggests we use 4096 by 2048 pixels. So if we do that, and you'll see because the vertical is half the horizontal, it kind of calculated the other one for us. And then let's basically hit stitch, see what we end up with. I'll give it a quick name for the batch file it's going to run, and off it goes. And there's lots of exciting data scrolling past. Looks kind of like the Matrix. Shouldn't take too long. It's kind of just over halfway through now. Okay, so that's finally finished. It took 5 minutes or so, I guess, in the end. And what we've ended up with is our stitched image here, which we now need to open up in something like Photoshop. Okay, so why are we opening it in Photoshop? Basically, we don't want the blue sky, because what happens is when this becomes our landscape in Stellarium, we need the blue sky to be transparent so that it can display all the stars and planets and whatnot. So what we need to do is ideally get rid of the blue sky. So there's various ways we can do this. Let's have a look, and we can try a sort of colour selection like this. Get all these little bits in, but we don't want the mountains over there in the selection. So we can fine-tune this just a little bit. It doesn't need to be completely accurate, but the better you do it, the nicer the end result will be. So let's just make sure that these mountains are not included. Okay, and if we scroll over to the other side, that looks pretty good. And then we can paint over this with the eraser. Okay, and if we just deselect, just go across that selection line in case there was any feathering in there. I don't think there was. Okay, and we can save that. And we want to save it out ideally as a PNG because they offer us the transparency. And let's give it a proper name, like that. Okay, so we've now done step 7, which is to mask the blue sky, save as a PNG. This does mention you can lower the image size if you want, if you've got a PC that's maybe a little older and slower. Okay, so now we've done that, we need to create a file that Stellarium will be able to read, and we also need to put it in the right place. So if we go into, now I've got to remember, Stellarium in program files, there is a folder called landscapes, and we can create a new folder in here, and we'll call it Santa Maddalena in the dump, and we can copy our PNG file over into there. Now, because this is in program files, that's why it's giving me that warning. What I did before for ease of editing and so on was just to edit the permissions on this folder. Success. Okay. Now the contents of this file, Google Earth helpfully will already have for us if we click on the pano name, and we can just basically copy everything from the landscape heading down to the bottom. So copy that to the clipboard, come in here and drop it in, and then we can just edit the site name. So this is Santa Maddalena, author is James, description we can edit Santa Maddalena church view, and the file name, which we named it earlier, is just that, all lowercase. I'll copy and paste it so I don't get it wrong, and I think the rest of it we can leave as is. So we'll save that file. And now, in theory, I'm not sure if we need to reload Stellarium or not, but if we go to location I've already got in there with the relevant bits of data, but the landscape is the other bit that we can change. It's already loaded it for us. Okay, so you'll see it's picked up the description and various bits and pieces in there, and it's actually already loaded it. What I'll do is tick minimal brightness and turn this up a little bit so we can actually see our beautiful new landscape. So if I close that, and there we go. We are now stood on our hillside, and we can look around. My monitor needs calibrating. See down the valley. So we'll also have a lovely view of the Milky Way here. And we can then scroll back in time and work out exactly where and when the moon will appear. So the time we checked earlier, sort of 10:30, we now realise actually the moon will still be behind the mountains at that point. However, by about pretty much 11:15, it should just start to peep out behind this mountain. And what we can also do is turn on the ocular view. So if I hit this and just zoom back out a bit, you can probably hear the cat there. She probably wants feeding. So I'll tell it about my Sony camera, and let's tell it what lens we've got, which I don't do under lens, we do under telescope. So we can tell that with an 80mm lens we'd get this kind of a field of view. With a 35mm lens we'd get this sort of a view. Whoops, I didn't want to click on that. Let's go back. Where were we? This is our 200mm lens. With this we could of course zoom right in and get the moon between the mountains. And with a 20mm lens, depending on where we place it, we could get a very wide field of view, including the Milky Way and so on. So that's pretty much it. Let's turn that off again. So now anytime we want to plan a shot from this location, we've got the tools available to do it. So if we're not just interested in the lunar eclipse, but we wanted to see what this view would be like in September, for example, we can drop forwards a couple of months. And if we go and look at the beginning of the month, we can whiz around a bit, and we can sort of choose the time of day, so we can tell that obviously it gets dark earlier in September. The Milky Way is located just off to the west there, and obviously if we look at something like December, we can tell that we might get a really nice view of the Orion constellation over those mountains if we happen to be there at well, you know, sort of 11 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night, that kind of thing. So I hope that was kind of useful. As you probably saw, entering all the figures and saving all the individual files is a little bit time consuming, but the end result is quite a nice thing to have. So a lot of people would perhaps do this for a location like where they live, because it means you've then got it available for seeing what's in the night sky from a sort of realistic view of any time of the year, so it's really good for planning. Or as I've done here, if you're planning on going on a trip somewhere, you can do the same thing, and it makes for a really nice planning tool because it'll sort of simulate exactly what you're going to see. If you've tried this and found ways to speed up the process, please do let me know in the comments, and I'm sure anyone else who's watched this will find that useful too. Otherwise, have fun, thanks for watching, and see you again soon.